Hi, everybody. This is Joe Firestone for Real Progressives. I'm here tonight with Brian Rosser. I know Brian was running earlier for Congress in the Georgia 14th. It turns out that he has withdrawn from that race and is now running for the House of Delegates in the Georgia 5th District. Is that right, Brian?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so Brian is going to tell us about his campaign and what he stands for at the state level. He's running as a progressive, I think, and I think he's got some favorite issues that he wants to talk to us about. So please welcome Brian Rossa.
Thank you so much for having me, Joe. I appreciate it a lot.
Sure, Brian.
My chief concern in politics, the reason I wanted to get involved in politics in the first place, is that there is no one on the federal, well, very few people on the federal level, and no one on the state level representing workers, educators, anybody who isn't a billionaire or a millionaire. So the reason I wanted to get involved was to give people the progressive option, but to give them a voice beyond complaining on the internet. To get your legislators to do anything is an impossible task unless you have given $2,700 to their campaign on the campaign trail. They won't even listen to you. So I'm trying to take the common man's perspective to the Georgia House of Representatives. But I stand on the progressive platform. I believe Bernie Sanders has it figured out, and the people who follow behind him, Nina Turner, Ro Khanna, but there is a lack of progressive values in the Georgia General Assembly.
Okay. And so you have a platform to address that.
Yes. One of my main concern is money in politics. So I refuse corporate PAC donations, and what motivated me to run for the 5th district is the representative in my town, Calhoun, in the 5th district. His name is John Meadows, and he had introduced this bill that was pitched as this environmentally conscious measure to protect Georgia's waterways. It's House Bill 205, and he received a lot of praise for it. And I read the bill, and after reading the bill, it doesn't do any of that. What it does is it establishes a regulatory board from the Georgia Department of Natural Resources. They appoint the members that will be on this regulatory oil and gas board to set the rules for fracking. In Georgia, your utilities are controlled by the Southern Company monopoly, and the ex-vice president of Southern Company sits on this board. So this is one more way that we will see industry oversee their own oversight. It's pretty brazen. It's very brazen, and no one really discussed it. I know the man got a trophy for it from an environmentalist group, got a trophy for writing this bill, and I don't know that they read the bill. So that's I want to keep fracking out of Georgia. It leaves we know what it does. And it's always the same everywhere it happens. It brings no good. Another problem that I want to address is Georgia has, I think, the 3rd worst healthcare outcomes and we pay more than 40 other states for health care here. There are a lot of uninsured and underinsured people, especially in rural Georgia, and Georgia denied Medicaid expansion. And if we were to expand that now, that would cover between 300,000 and 600,000 low-income Georgians who otherwise won't get the medical care that they need at all. And I don't understand how they justified not expanding it to begin with, but the Democrats in the Georgia General Assembly are really pushing hard for expansion. So it's not exactly House Resolution 676, which is what I believe we need. But it's a start. It's absolutely a start. Another thing that I'm passionate about is criminal justice reform. In Georgia, the powers that be have essentially outsourced our criminal justice system to private corporations who couldn't care less about administering justice. All they care about is their own profits and their bottom line. And that has exploded the prison population. There are, I believe, 4 private prisons in Georgia that are ran by either GA Group or the CCA, and the conditions are terrible. What the inmates go through is terrible. It's medieval. It's horrible, and we're overpaying for this. We pay them more to have these horrible facilities than we would a facility with federal oversight. And an industry that makes its profits, that is incentivized to fill beds in a prison, is inherently corrupt. And through my interpretation of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and Georgia's own Constitution, I believe it's unconstitutional. So I would very much like to see real reform come to Georgia's prisons, and why people are arrested.
Unconstitutional because of cruel and unusual punishment?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
They're horrible. They're very horrible. And beyond the privatized prison industry, I think that real reform begins with legalizing cannabis in a way that straying from the medical marijuana point of view that puts the profits by default in the hands of the people who have lobbied against it, or who have tried to stop it from becoming a reality. I believe we should legalize it in Georgia, but we should do it with a clear, progressive vision of the future and think about how we could structure legalization so that it is tied to a more robust social safety net, especially considering what's happening on the federal level.
What is the political situation in terms of the legislature now? Is there a fairly even distribution between the parties, or are the Republicans dominating?
The Republicans are dominating. The Republicans are dominating, but very few of them are unopposed. The notable ones have a Democratic challenger. There are just in my area, there are 19 Democratic challengers. So, but of course that's municipal and state level as well. But I believe a blue wave is going to hit Georgia very hard. I believe we're going to see a massive change. And I believe this will be the first time in a long time that we've had a Democratic government. It's
okay. So is there a possibility that the legislature would change?
Oh yes. I believe it's a certainty. I absolutely believe it's a certainty. And the Republicans in Georgia aren't like Republicans in other places. They are they're not doing themselves any favors with their rhetoric here. So I definitely see Democrats at least taking the House, if not the Senate as well.
Well, actually, there are a lot of states like that where they're not really doing themselves any favors. Now, they seem to be really particularly medieval at the state level, and are no longer even pretending otherwise. Okay, so have you got a website for your state level run?
Yes, it's going live immediately following the primaries. It's rosterforgeorgia.com, and all the links to my platform and all the other sites that I'm on. I have a crowd pack. It's not published yet. I want to have comprehensive policy goals written out for people to donate. But that's
Okay, so I suppose my next question should be: are you going to run in the general, regardless of what happens in the primaries?
yes, sir. I do not have a primary challenger. I'm unopposed.
Oh, you are unopposed as a Democrat in your district?
Yes, sir.
So you're a sure winner.
Well, I'm going up against a Republican incumbent, but I do not.
Right, but not in the primary, right?
Right.
Right. So you're going up against the Republican incumbent in the general.
Yes, sir.
So you may have a good chance in the general.
I believe so. All of the candidates around here are picking up a lot of steam. We're all on the same page, and we all have something to offer that's vastly different from what people have been seeing. So I think all of us have a really good chance. And that's the same with all the overlapping House district or Senate districts over my district, and then the adjacent Senate districts. They are also unopposed and have no primary challenger. So that's kind of a thematic in Northwest Georgia.
Oh, that's really interesting. So what are the major cities around the Northwest Georgia area?
Well, in the 14th congressional district, Calhoun is also in that. That's Calhoun, Rome, Dalton. Rome and Dalton are the bigger population centers. There's Catoosa County, Fort Oglethorpe. It's very rural, but there are some larger cities. I would say the largest are probably where I'm at, Calhoun, Rome, and Dalton. And they're all packed together.
I see. So the economy around there must be fairly depressed then.
It's part of my district is Murray County, and there, if you take all the income and split it up amongst all the people there, people are earning about $15,000. And then here in Calhoun, we've seen a lot more economic growth. So if you income per capita here, I believe is around $23,000, but people have, especially the hourly workers, have enough to get by and pay their bills and have just about nothing. There are a lot of people who are dependent on food stamps. It's pretty rough. The wages are low. There's no union presence, of course, in a right to work state. So we have temp agencies. We don't have unions. So economically, businesses are doing well, but the individual is not doing very well.
So there could well be a space for the kind of platform that you had in your run for Congress also, right?
Yes. My platform, the reason I have that perspective is because I've lived a lot of the subjects that are covered in it, and it's not unique to me. A lot of the people around here are dealing with the same things, especially in, like I said, Murray County. People just don't have insurance. People just don't, most people out there are working $8 an hour. The rent is high. It's a mess. So I believe it would transfer pretty well to the state level, but it's a lot more flexible on the state level, I believe, as well, because a lot of the solutions to these problems have already been tried in other places. So it's not such a gamble. There's only, I would say, about 10 million people in Georgia. So progressive policies in effect in Georgia, I believe it's very, very doable. And the money is there, especially after Georgia is hyped as the #1 state for business. After you look at what happened with the Trump tax cuts, which from my perspective is workers were forced to give a $1.9 trillion bailout to their bosses, or handout to their bosses, they can afford it. And that was whenever I was talking about policy a moment ago, one of the main policies that I would like to see happen in Georgia, we have to raise the minimum wage. Our minimum wage is $5.15 an hour. So we go off of the federal, the $7.25 an hour. Let me ask you, whenever that famous graph where you look at how wages have stagnated since the 1970s, while
Yes.
If wages had kept up with workplace productivity and CEO bonuses, what would the minimum wage be? I hear $22.50 pretty often.
Yeah, that's what I hear too.
So I think it's completely
$22.50. Also, of course, there are the national job guarantee programs that are getting pushed now by Cory Booker and by Gillibrand and by Bernie Sanders, of course. And what they've been talking about is a $15 an hour. And they call it a living wage. Now, also by Richard Dean Winfield, who's running in the Georgia 10th, for Congress, is advocating for a federal job guarantee with what he calls a fair living wage at $20 per hour.
That sounds about right.
The Georgia 10th is the district that Athens, Georgia, is in. And in fact, he's a professor at the university there. And also a rare bird, actually, for a professor, because he's also a member of the Communications Workers of America, the CWA. Okay, so he's a professor who's a union member.
That is an odd bird around here, for sure.
Yeah, which is kind of interesting. But he has a very, very wonderful platform. And it seemed to be doing very well in his race. It seems like both there are lots of Democrats. When he canvasses, he describes the reactions of the Democrats and also the reactions of the Republicans, who are predominantly white. And he says that 85% of them are in favor of the job guarantee program and have promised to vote for him. Which is kind of interesting, but he has to get through the primary first, of course. And I don't think they can vote in the primary down there. So,
does his challenger pass the progressive litmus test?
No, I don't think so. I think that Richard is the most progressive person in his race. Actually, most probably by far. He's not only running on a job guarantee, but a new social bill of rights, but for people. And he basically looks back for his programs to the New Deal. Okay, it's like an FDR economic bill of rights updated to the present time. And really, pretty much chapter and verse. And that's what he's running on.
I'm seeing that quite a bit.
No, I'm sorry, say that again.
I'm seeing that quite a bit. The resurgence of the New Deal mentality, which on the federal level, the establishment Democrats are pushing a better deal, or
Yeah, they're
whatever it was
pushing
they
a better
called it.
deal, but when you go over to the progressive side, uh, they're more and more looking back to the way we should have gone after FDR died.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're talking a lot about the unfinished business, okay, of FDR. I'm seeing that a lot in the candidates, okay, that I interview. So why did you switch out of the congressional race into the state level?
Because I'm an average Joe trying to step into politics. So I I've been studying politics for several years now, and I understand that it is a pay to play endeavor. Um, but fundraising was very difficult for if your opponent has a war chest of $7 million and you're having a hard time raising 5,200 to get on the ballot. It's locked down pretty tight here, so that only a specific class of person runs and succeeds. So I had every intention of running against Tom Graves. That's exactly what I wanted to do. Uh, but after I was unable to meet those fundraising goals, uh, I couldn't stay out of it. I feel like right now, anyone, whether you have a master's degree or whether you have a background in politics or not, anyone who is talking sense should, at the very least, get their name on the ballot and try to give voters the progressive option. So I wasn't going to just be done with it and wash my hands of it. Instead, I kind of regrouped and decided to go and run against John Meadows and went and qualified. It's much much cheaper.
So, with respect to your state program, what would you do about the opioid crisis?
Uh, when it comes to the opioid crisis, my perspective of it isn't very pretty, and it doesn't sound attractive. I feel like the whole thing is largely manufactured because there is no meaningful effort on the federal level to do anything about it or to try to curb it. And everyone knows someone else who has had their lives impacted in some way by it. So I really believe that the crisis begins in the hospitals. I've seen that over and over and over again. So I think look at I believe there's a small town in West Virginia with a population of 3,000, and they were getting over 1 million OxyContin or oxycodone pills sent to their community. That's the problem. I think we need to hold the manufacturers accountable. I believe doctors need to explore other options. There are ways to treat chronic pain outside of heroin, given patients heroin. And like I said, I'm also a firm believer that the path forward is legalizing cannabis. I know that has had an effect on curbing it in varying degrees around the country. I know that's helped out a lot of folks. But I
Yes,
don't think the solution
I
is.
think
Excuse
right
me.
now CBD oil is helping a lot of people with their pain.
Yes, yes, it
Uh,
does.
is it legal to get it in Georgia?
Uh, yes, yeah, it is. It's you can get it, but it's difficult for people who are going to a doctor. You know, a doctor's not exactly going to send them to get that. As far as prescriptions, I don't know of anyone getting a prescription for it around here. I know you can just go and buy it from certain vendors. Um, but
Yeah, you can buy it
I
over
doubt
the
it's doing
web.
anything. Excuse me?
I say that you can buy it over the web.
Right, right. Um, yeah, there are a lot of very visible problems with the opioid epidemic here. It's evident. So if that is making an impact, I don't know how much of an impact it is making. And it might be because people don't know about it. It's never mentioned to them, or it just doesn't work for them. I'm not entirely certain.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of people it doesn't actually work for, but not the CBD oil because that's the inert form of cannabis.
I believe the
So you don't really have a specific policy on the state level to help with it.
uh, not in clear terms. I don't think that the solution is to uh, punish the people who are using it, or to what I can't remember what's it called if someone overdoses. It's a fast acting pen. Um, I'm not so sure if we're going to do something about it, we have to acknowledge where it comes from, and putting more restrictions on the people who are more apt to be addicted, or to have a prescription that they end up spiraling out of control and getting addicted to it. There's really nothing meaningful. So when it comes to policy, I don't know if I have anything concrete other than refocusing on where it begins, and taking a look at the hospitals and the overprescription of opioids.
You said earlier that there are other ways of treating pain, such as.
Um, well, I see Ernesto has mentioned one, kratom. I know that's under fire right now. Um, I think that a lot of the problems that people have could be solved by, and of course, I'm no medical expert. I can't say, but the way people live their lives, it's very work, 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 work. A lot of people work 60-hour work weeks. They don't end up having time to really do anything. If we put more of a focus on long-term solutions like therapy, or even diet. These are things that are never really mentioned when people come in with chronic pain. They're usually quick to throw an opioid at them,
Yes.
and not all pain relievers are opioids, but that's the only thing that you see being prescribed. There's no, from my experience and from what I've seen with my friends and family, when someone is dealing with chronic pain and they're talking with their doctor, there is never a long-term plan moving forward of changing anything else in that person's life other than take this pill every 4 hours and it'll make it stop hurting. So I've never seen it. I was involved in a car accident that messed up my knees really bad. And I had to have 2 surgeries, one on each. And the solution after the surgery, it really wasn't therapy. It was more opioids and more opioids and more opioids. So in my own personal experience, I've seen that. My father, he had a spinal surgery that went wrong. And
God.
there were, from what I understand, from what I've heard from from medical professionals, there were a lot of routes they could have gone, but they ended up sticking on the opioids for very long-term basis without any other modifications in his day-to-day life, without changing any of his habits or even stressing him that he should change his habits. And however long later, there is that dosage increases over time, and now he is paying for it. He's in end-stage liver failure. So, and that's directly from the overprescription of opioids. And if you just look at how it works here, it's opioids. So when I say I think there should be treatments beyond opioids, like I said, I'm not a medical professional. I don't know what those are. But if it's strictly opioids, that's not going to be good for anyone, except for the people who are selling the opioid painkillers.
Sure. Okay, so what are the particular bills that you favor on the state level?
Not a lot of them. We don't have, I'm sure you know about the American Legislative Exchange Council. We don't have ALEC bills moving through. We have ALEC laws. So a lot of the things that end up in the bills that pass are, I call them Trojan horses.
Yeah.
It's usually a deceptive Orwellian name that makes something sound really fantastic. And under the hood, it's a Trojan horse. So yes. I don't agree with a lot of what's happening here. And like we were discussing earlier, we have a Republican-dominated legislature. So it is very pro-corporate, pro-business, anti-consumer. Gives corporations a pass to step all over pretty much anyone they want. So there's really nothing I'm explicitly in favor of except for expanding Medicaid. I believe we really should have done that when the option was first available. Should not have waited on that.
Sure. Is there any legislation you favor that would do anything about the criminal justice system with respect to the kind of violence that we see there each day by the police?
No, there have been efforts on the Democratic side, and it's some bipartisan support to try and curb civil asset forfeiture, because Georgia, in Calhoun, where I'm at, the 5th District, we're very fortunate to have reasonable law enforcement. There, you don't see that sort of thing here, but in the more urban places, in Metro Atlanta, Kennesaw, Marietta.
Well, you're seeing civil asset forfeiture there when you drive through the towns?
You don't. I haven't actually personally seen it, but I know that Georgia's cops have taken it to extremes, and there have been some measures to curb it where they were required to start reporting what they took and how much and what it was used for. But it hasn't slowed down enough to not seem just like you're guilty until proven innocent.
Yes.
Um,
And so you can't pass any legislation to do anything about that?
I I think it needs to go, but such a bill
And
has
so
not
do
been
I.
introduced. Uh, that's a big part of my platform is getting rid of civil asset forfeiture.
Oh, so that's a bill
It's,
you would introduce into the legislature
oh, absolutely, absolutely.
in Georgia.
As far as police brutality, that is, it's it's pretty obscene all over the country. Uh, and I think to get a hold on that, what what I want to see happen is that our police officers are adequately trained, and they don't have that. They don't walk into every situation with this impending fear of being shot and acting irrationally right out of the gate, taking it to 10 immediately. Um, think think any profession and how long somebody has to go to school for that profession, and then how long does it take to become a cop? You can do that in under a year, 6 months or something like that around here. Um, I think we need to have ongoing training for law enforcement, and we definitely have to remove the uh, the profit motive from law enforcement outside of salaries. Because if you have if law enforcement is supposed to get a portion of their funding from making so many arrests with the quotas and whatnot, uh, who are they going to go after? They're going to go after the poor, people of color. They're going to go after the vulnerable. So I think everything begins with removing the profit motive from law enforcement. That is an open door to corruption and to things like we see. Um, and the the cops that you see that do the unspeakable, terrible things that are being caught on film, these people have histories of doing this. It's usually a routine thing.
Yes.
They This happens over and over and over, and they keep getting by with it and keep getting by with it and keep getting by with it. So at a certain point, do you wait to do something about it until there is a camera and somebody saw it, or do we take that into consideration? If someone is routinely victimizing people, oppressing the people that they're supposed to protect, um, I think that needs to be taken into consideration. And I don't think that we should be giving them a free pass over and over and over. So that's I don't know if that would ever make it into any legislation right now, as it stands right now. Uh, but I would be happy to introduce something that at least addresses that, because if we you have to acknowledge the problem, and the problems usually get buried. It usually gets covered up, and no one talks about it. So, but I haven't exactly seen or been paying close attention to what other states have done either. So, so when it comes to legislation, I'm not sure of any legislation that we could model here and do that.
It sounds like a kind of a depressing situation in Georgia.
It is. It's rough.
Is the situation any different around the big cities?
There's definitely more social mobility, more opportunity, but there's also that's where the crime happens, uh, and that's where things are best for people who want to jumpstart their career, but it's also the worst for the poor and people of color. So it's I don't know, it's the rest of Georgia on a larger scale from what I can see.
Boy. Well, okay. I think it might be time, okay, for you to summarize what you're offering to the citizens of the Georgia Fifth.
Okay.
And to compare it with your competition.
Sane gun legislation, regulation. I'm a gun owner. I don't think we have to kick in anyone's doors and take their guns, but I think we also need to make meaningful, serious. We need to take meaningful, serious steps towards separating gun owners from, law-abiding gun owners from the class of person that would walk in and shoot up a school. I think we need a tiered licensing system that includes psychiatric evaluations, training. My opponent is, of course, he doesn't take any money directly from the NRA, but he always receives awards and quite a bit of publicity from the NRA. He is going to do whatever they tell him to do, and the NRA has gone off the rails. So they are not what they used to be. They represent the gun markets, not gun owners. And good luck convincing him of that.
Sure.
Expanding Medicaid, that is very important to a lot of people. That's your jobs program as well. He is the chair of the Rules Committee. He wouldn't let that pass. There's absolutely no way he would let that pass, even if a Republican introduced it. When it comes to insurance, affordable insurance, Bernie Sanders has laid out a plan for the whole country. And if you look at, I've read House Resolution 676 many, many times, and the more I read it, the better it sounds. And you can't do all of that on the state level. It's just not possible. But we can take.
Yeah, that is now Keith Ellison's bill.
Yes, Keith
I
Ellison.
said that the sponsor of that, okay, is Keith Ellison now that John Conyers has gone.
Right. So I think we should definitely re-examine our how insurance works here. My opponent, he is an insurance agent, and he, like I said, he is the chair of the Rules Committee, so he oversees his own oversight. He introduces and votes in favor of legislation that lines his own pockets. Literally, that's exactly what he is doing.
Amazing.
So I think he needs to go for that reason alone. Shoot, I was going somewhere with that. I think we need to compare to John Meadows. He will shill for fossil fuel companies without a doubt. And after I explained House Bill 205, what that does. In the 70s and 80s, a lot of people had their they sold the mineral rights to their properties off to fossil fuel companies, and they're about to have to make good on their side of that deal. And we're going to see a lot of fracking in Georgia. I think that's going backwards, and he has paved the way for that. I think we need to move forward with solarizing all public buildings, especially schools. In Georgia, teachers can't strike by law. They can't. Public officials can't unionize by law. So I think since they don't have a voice, a collective voice, we need to solarize the schools so that they can eliminate their energy expenses. And I know this sounds idealistic, but if they're cutting out close to $400,000 a year on their energy expenses, you can pay teachers a higher wage, and that is definitely moving forward from fracking. That is, fracking is definitely going backwards. And I'm not certain that John Meadows is in bed with the privatized prison industrial complex, but he is a Republican, and I believe I can predict his votes pretty reliably. I think we need to stop that. I feel like we should run these companies out that do this. I don't think it should be. I feel that it's unconstitutional, and I don't believe we should be outsourcing criminal justice. So that's a major difference. And that might be party lines. But that's
okay. So those are the things you want to do.
Huh?
So those are the things you want to do when you get into the House of Delegates.
Yes, sir. And
well, it sounds like a big improvement over what you've got.
Excuse me?
Sounds like a big improvement over what you've got.
I like to think so. It's not working for anybody except for people who were born in the right area with the right name and the right skin tone. So I believe that the progressive platform is sorely needed in the Georgia General Assembly.
Okay, so let me ask you something. Why isn't the state legislature and also the governor, in other words, why aren't the officials in Georgia attempting to lobby the federal government for a revenue sharing program? It sounds like tax revenues for state projects in Georgia are really very skimpy, and that all the state programs are being cut by right and left, and that their tax incentives that are going to businesses that want to move into Georgia, and those tax incentives are very important, okay, in impoverishing the state government.
Yes.
Okay, so why not seek some revenue sharing funds from the federal government? Used to be during the Carter administration, and there's a Georgia guy. Okay, and also during the Nixon and Ford administrations too, that there were very large federal revenue sharing programs that were really doing a lot to improve the state budgets. Okay, especially true during downturns. Because during downturns of the economy, tax revenues really shrink at the state level. Because as consumption shrinks, of course, sales taxes also shrink. So why have the states, and states like Georgia, ceased to lobby the federal government for revenue sharing?
I don't know that I am able to answer that in any meaningful kind of way.
It's really a question to be discussed, okay, with other governing officials in Georgia, and to get people to understand that if they pressured enough, and if they pressured with other states, there are revenues that can be had from the federal government. Not necessarily from the federal government that's in power now, but if there was the blue wave that you're talking about on the state, okay, and on the federal levels, then there would be a government that is far more progressive, okay, than the current government. Okay,
Yeah,
and
that's something I
moreover,
haven't really put any thought into at all.
yeah, I think it may be something to think about, okay, because
Absolutely.
when the government actually changes, there are going to be people coming into office who know that federal taxes do not actually fund federal spending. That the only thing that funds federal spending is the appropriations of Congress, first of all, and the authority that Congress gives to the Federal Reserve to fill the Treasury spending account. For example, what Congress could do, if it wanted to, and I'm going to put a little figure up there for you to take a look at. Okay, I'm going to make that go solo for a second. And what that says is it's in the form of a question to a congressional candidate, which could be asked by the press, by the media, by places like CNN, okay, or MSNBC. Your programs look expensive. How are you going to pay for them? Well, the simple answer to that is, well, where the Congress will just order the Federal Reserve to give Treasury the money. But do you know that that can be done?
Oh,
That's a direct logical implication of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. In other words, the spending power, the power of the purse, rests with Congress alone. Now, it has delegated some of that power to the Fed and some of that power to the Treasury. Okay. But the delegation of part of its power does not mean that it still doesn't have that power left. It does, okay, according to the Constitution. And it can order the Federal Reserve anytime it wants to simply give the Treasury money to spend without that money either having anything to do with taxation or bond sales. In fact, if things were done in this way, then a sufficient amount of money could be given to Treasury to pay off the national debt as it falls due within any period of time, okay, the period of an appropriations bill, for example. Most probably in the next 6 months, perhaps something on the order of $4 trillion is going to be repaid by the federal government. However, there will be new debt instruments that will be sold in roughly the same amount. So the national debt is not going to be reduced. Okay, but if Congress were to order the Fed to fill the Treasury account with sufficient money to pay down the national debt, then there wouldn't be any reason for the Treasury Department to sell any more debt instruments when it deficit spends. In other words, it could have its deficits, and it could also pay off the national debt at the same time. Okay. So knowing that this could be done by the Congress, the implication of it also is that the Congress, if it so desired, could easily appropriate a $600 billion revenue sharing program for the states, which could be apportioned by population.
right.
The only thing that's standing in the way of that is political pressure from the populace and from the state governments. And the way the federal framework has been treating the state governments lately, but specifically not doing anything about a race to the bottom caused by the large companies that are extracting tax incentives from the states, it seems to me the federal government, since it hasn't been doing anything about this, really does owe compensation to the states.
I can agree with that 100%.
I say this because a simple law written at the federal level could stop the relocations of business from one state but to another state where the states were facilitating the transfer by giving the businesses tax incentives. It could prohibit those tax incentives and force the states to compete, on other grounds, like, for example, having a better educational system, or having public facilities of various kinds, which would be more attractive to the employees of the relocating businesses. Now, there are other incentives that can be offered outside of tax incentives, which, instead of creating a race to the bottom, would create a race to the top.
Yeah, Georgia's the tax benefits for companies coming here. That's how this state got to be the #1 state for business. Now, what's being discussed is giving out public land. So I believe that's a disaster waiting to happen. But
it sure is a disaster waiting to happen.
And through that, based on, if I'm understanding you correctly, that would mean, to me, the notion that businesses and corporations are not responsible for infrastructure, that they are not responsible for paying taxes, even though it's their freight that's, tears up the roads. It's people moving back and forth in their vehicles on public roads that causes the damage. If that leveled the playing ground, not so much leveled the playing ground, that would also be a way to hold corporations to a higher standard of and to, I would say, raise their taxes to some reasonable degree.
Yeah, I think if we ended the race to the bottom, it would be possible also to raise taxes of the corporations, and then for the states to do really good things for their citizens. But I think they do need a share of the federal money to do it, simply because the states are the users of the federal currency, but the federal government is the issuer of the federal currency. So that's entirely different. It's only the federal government that is able to create the reserves, which the Treasury Department is then primarily using to spend. In other words, there's very little currency out there compared to reserves, and very little in coins out there compared to reserves. I think something like 97% of our money supply today is in the form of bank reserves, bank balances that exist in banks. It's all keystrokes. Yeah. Exactly. So you've heard that term, that it's all keystrokes.
Yes, sir.
So that must be spreading around the population.
Yeah, I mean, it's it seems like the logical conclusion to where we're at. It just makes good sense.
Yeah.
But I don't know why our government has not been doing that. Would you say
Oh,
that seems like
because
a collective effort amongst the states, uh, not the individual states on their own?
right. Uh, there used to be lobbies in Washington that were pretty powerful. One was the National Governors Association. I think that probably still exists. But one of the things they used to do was to lobby for federal revenue sharing programs. I think the Reagan administration really began to tamp that down. And then probably the Clinton administration just ended it, I suspect. I don't think there's much of it, okay, that is going on anymore. And then there was also the U.S. Conference, okay, of Mayors and the National Association, okay, of Counties. All those interest groups were based here in Washington, and they would pressure the Congress for revenue sharing funds. And they were quite successful during the latter part of the 1960s and the 1970s. Okay, and I think that was a good thing. During that the period of time, I was doing some the policy work in the area of the revenue sharing and funding formulas that were used to determine how much money from a particular program would go to each of the states. And the funding formulas were based on the poverty indicators and housing indicators, okay, and various social indicators. And while not a perfect way of allocating funding, it was a lot better than what goes on today.
Yeah,
Uh,
that sounds like a pathway to, based off everything that you've said. That just sounds like a pathway to uh, fixing health insurance.
well, I don't know. I mean, I think the best way to fix health insurance, okay, and I agree with you on this, is just to pass HR 676. Okay, I think that's the gold standard in the health insurance area. Now, I would, at the federal level, I would fund it in a different way. Okay, I wouldn't have the Conyers method, okay, funding it. What I would do is just to fund the stuff as as deficit spending. I wouldn't raise taxes any more than we have today. We're already spending almost as much on healthcare at the federal and state levels than it would cost to implement HR 676.
Yeah.
In other words, when you really look at the numbers fairly closely, and you look at some of the predictions of how much money out of pocket. Okay, I'll get some figures for you. We're spending 3.4 trillion right now in terms of the costs for medical care.
And there's
By some of
30
the
million or so uninsured. So
right, right. Uh, okay, but by some of the predictions, okay, that are out there, and these may be optimistic. Okay, I'm not saying that they're completely correct. Some economists are estimating that we could get as much as a 50% saving on that if we went to HR 76.
I
So
believe
that
that.
means instead of spending 3.4 trillion coming out of people's pockets, because in one way or another it comes out of people's pockets, either in the form of taxes or in the form of copays or deductibles or premiums. They all come out of the private pockets.
Right.
So there would be a distribution, okay, of expenditures instead of the private sector spending 3.4 trillion on healthcare. It would perhaps be spending only 1.7 trillion, which is what it's spending now to fund the government portion of that.
Right.
So, okay, now I'm not sure it would be 50% saving, but I'm nearly certain it would be one third.
It would at a minimum. Because
Yeah,
that's the nature of healthcare in the United States is it's a vicious business, and
yeah.
which is the product. There's a medication called it's for the cure, I believe, for hepatitis C, and it's called Harvoni. And if you don't have insurance, it will cost you what is it, $87,000, and it costs between $68 and $200 to manufacture this drug. So it costs the same amount to manufacture in India, so they sell it for $200. Here, it's an $86,800 markup. So I can see 50% seems reasonable. I believe that could happen. And
Yes,
that's
I
one
think it
example.
could happen
It's
also.
ridiculous.
Okay, but even at the one third, okay, it's still a savings of 1.2 or 1.3 trillion dollars
Right.
out of our pockets.
Right.
Okay, and the Republicans at the national level distort this, but basically by questioning the level of savings, okay, but also by pointing out that, uh, well, now governments are paying 1.7 trillion. Okay, and if the cost of federal government were to go up to 2.2 trillion, 2.3 trillion, we'd just be spending a lot more. And they completely ignore the fact that we're spending a lot more anyway because it's all coming out of our pockets. It makes no difference to us if there's some transfer to the federal government in order to save 1.2 or 1.3 trillion dollars, with the possibility of actually saving 1.7 trillion dollars. That's a pretty good deal any way you slice it.
Yeah, I don't understand
So,
the. Well, I mean, I do understand it. There's a lot of people that don't want single payer to pass, powerful people. But the most common thing that I've heard outside of this is 2018, and any form of compassion is communism now. But what I hear often is, how are you going to pay for that? We already pay for that. We already pay more.
well, we already pay for it, okay, but I'll put this up again. If you're in Congress and you get that question, then you can answer it just by saying this. That's how we're going to pay for it.
Is this what you're saying? We'll just order the federal treasurer to give the money. Where else do you see that happening? Do you think that happens so that we can fight a war? Or, take your
Well,
pick.
sometimes it does, but sometimes it does. It is said, actually, has been said. I don't know if this is entirely accurate, but when the Congress recently approved the military budget, it approved an increase of $70 billion, which the military did not ask for. On its own, it just decided to put in $70 billion more. It did not do that using the so-called pay-go method that they're supposed to use in Congress. It just appropriated the extra $70 billion and did not specify any taxes to pay for that. Okay, so basically what it is saying to the Treasury Department, okay, we're not giving you any more tax money to pay for this, but we're mandating, in other words, we're ordering that you spend not only the $700 billion that we currently are paying for, but also the extra $70 billion, that we took it in our heads to appropriate. Okay. So the question arises, where does the Treasury Department actually get this money? Well, the truth is it's going to get the extra $70 billion by selling debt instruments. Now, who gives the Treasury Department the authority to sell the debt instruments? And who says that if the Treasury Department has the authority to sell the debt instruments, that the Federal Reserve has to credit by the revenue that goes to the Treasury Department in the Treasury spending account?
That'd be Congress.
Okay. That'd be Congress, yeah. It's the rules and procedures previously defined by Congress, which gives the Federal Reserve the authority to credit the federal spending account, or I should say the Treasury spending account. So this is really no different. I mean, okay. This particular specification here says where Congress will just order the Fed to give Treasury the money. So this appears to be something new, which is why I call it overt congressional financing. But the fact is there already exists what we might call covert congressional financing already, because Congress has set up a framework where the Federal Reserve creates new additions to balances within the Treasury spending account based on rules that Congress has set up to govern the relationships between the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department. So this is actually happening right now. It's just not visible to the public because they don't understand the procedures by which the Federal Reserve actually works. In other words, they don't know that when tax money or bond money flows into the government, it is first deleted by the Federal Reserve in marking down the private sector accounts. Okay, specifically the accounts of the banks that have accounts at the Federal Reserve. It marks down those accounts. In doing so, it destroys reserves. But then, in order to credit the Treasury spending account, it has to create entirely new reserves, high-powered money, the highest powered money there is in the United States. And it creates that in the Treasury spending account through keystrokes, just as you said. So that's the reality of what happens inside of the banking system. So this, a very simple answer here, would make that reality transparent to people. It makes it transparent to people. Okay, now, I gave that in the form of a one-sentence answer, but there's also legislative language that could be given to make that happen. And here's the legislative language there. It's just in two sentences. Could be put in a single clause of an appropriations bill. Okay, so you know these are these monster appropriation bills that are 2,300 pages or something like that. Well, there's one little paragraph, okay, in the appropriations bill, and the appropriation is paid for, and also the portion of the national debt that's falling due during the period of the appropriation is also paid for. Of course, if you do this, then you have to worry about, well, what do I do about inflation? Because the government has to create a sufficient amount of space that spending like this is not inflationary. So how does it do that? Well, the way it does it is Congress could pass a separate taxing bill, not so it balances the budget, but so it taxes enough, but not really too much. In other words, it taxes enough to maintain full employment at the national level, okay, but not enough that it fails to compensate for leakages of demand in the economy. Now, what are demand leakages actually due to? Private sector people who want to save money, okay, and who want to place the money in their savings accounts to sit there idle. And also leakages to the foreign sector when we import more than we export, which but these days is all the time. So from previous performance experience in the private sector, one can pretty well estimate that if the private sector was able to, it would like to save 6% of GDP each year. And if the private sector was able to, it would like to run a trade deficit of, as it happens, roughly 6%, okay, of GDP each year also. That means demand leakages of 12%, okay, of GDP. So those leakages have to be compensated for by the federal government. And how would that happen? Well, when you pass the tax bill, you would not pass so much in taxes as to create a balanced budget, but you would tax enough in order to remove a sufficient amount of the money from the economy, so that there remained a deficit of 12%, which would make up for the demand leakages. That's called a full employment budget. And people used to know what that meant in the late 60s and the early 70s, but over time they forgot that. Nobody talks about a full employment budget any longer. But a full employment budget is one that balances the economy as opposed to balancing the budget. Now, unfortunately, you can't do this at the state level.
Right.
So it could only be done at the federal level. Okay, but well, the implication of this all is that if our GDP currently is $20 trillion or close to it, that the deficit spending policy space we have, the federal government has, right now, is $2.4 trillion a year worth of deficit. And right now, people in Washington are getting upset because they're projecting that there's going to be an $850 billion deficit for this year, which is way, way short of the deficit spending that we actually need. Okay. Anyway, this is getting away from your state platform, okay, and into other things. But if you do get elected to the state, and pretty soon, you run for Congress, this kind of thing is important to know. Okay, because I looked at your platform for Congress, and you were advocating for paying everything through taxation. And that doesn't have to be done. It can be a weak spot in campaigns. Okay, and it can be a weak spot once you're in Congress when you're bargaining for benefits for people. Because it's a lot easier to get people on your side to give benefits to people if they feel they don't have to raise taxes to do so.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's a lot of
the,
go ahead.
So, but don't get me wrong, there are very good reasons to tax. And I won't go, through all of them now, but because it's getting late. But you can't get away without any taxing, because what taxes basically do is they drive the currency, and they make people need U.S. dollars in order to pay their taxes. And so U.S. dollars hold their value because people need U.S. dollars. Can't pay your taxes with bitcoins. You can't pay your taxes with chickens. Got to pay your taxes with those dollars. And to get those dollars, you have to work, or you have to invest, or you have to borrow from the banks, or whatever. All kinds of things you have to do to get those dollars to pay your taxes. But that's why the dollar actually retains its value over a period of time, because there's a certain amount of taxes. But there doesn't need to be the level of taxes that we now have. It's too much, and it's a drag on the economy, and we need more deficit spending. And it's a drag on the economy because there are these demand leakages every year. Now, they're not 6% of GDP right now. In each case, because since we have a down economy in the first place, it is not possible for people to save the 6% of GDP they would like to save. And it's not possible for them any longer to run a trade deficit, of 6%. So they have to be content but with less. But the way the economy has been going the last couple of years, even though it seems to be a good economy from the standpoint of the stock market, the private sector hasn't been saving a lot. It's at the aggregate demand level, it's hardly been saving anything at all anymore. It's getting into the situation we saw during the Bush administration and the Clinton administration, where for years on end, the private sector taken as a whole hardly saved anything. And we were still running trade deficits, that were very large. How is the private sector financing this? Through credit. The banks and the Federal Reserve were blowing bubble. and creating money for people to spend that was backed only by paper assets. When the bubble burst, the crash happened, and in some cases, the value of the real estate people were holding crashed to 60% of their height, or 40% of their height. They lost a huge amount of wealth they thought they had, but that in fact they never really did have, because it was all wealth on paper, coming from a bubble that blew up the real estate values. So anyway, I think it's time for us to call it close. I wish you luck in your race for the House of Delegates. I'm sure the House of Delegates needs you and more people that are like you who want to improve our situation.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate you having me on.
Okay, my pleasure.
And for schooling me as well. Got a lot of new things to look into from this conversation.
Okay, I'll send you some follow-ups, okay, to look into. I don't know how relevant they are at the state level. I suppose the only thing I've said, okay, which is relevant at the state level, is that I think all you state governments really need to get together again and get money out of Washington, because the capability to generate that money is there, and you need it at the state level. Okay, so you need to either pressure them to give it to you, or at a minimum, stop the race to the bottom by passing laws that stop these businesses from getting tax incentives when they move their headquarters all over the country. I mean, that is nonsense. It's making all the states poorer, and the whole war has to be stopped.
Yeah, Amazon.
Amazon, God. Damn Bezos.
Yeah.
What a bastard.
Yeah, that cat could, what's he worth, $125 billion? It wasn't too long ago he tweeted, I just really want to do some philanthropy work. Brother, you could end hunger for the next 5 years, still have $60 billion. Somebody has to spell it out for you. You don't want to do any philanthropy work at all.
Yeah, of course he's going to do a small percentage, and make it look very big, and it'll basically be a PR thing for him.
Yeah.
Okay, but to be fair, the $125 billion in his case is only real wealth in a temporary sense. Okay? In other words, if we had another crash in the economy, he would crash down, okay, along with all the rest of us, unless something was done to save the stock market. I mean, it could crash by 75% next time. And then he'd see a lot of his wealth actually go away. During the boom of the late 90s, there was a company by the name of MicroStrategy that was based here in the Washington area. And they were doing decision support systems, okay, and data warehousing. And for a while, they were really flying. And when they went public, they skyrocketed up, and then they split the stock a few times. At the height, the owner, or the primary owner anyway, he owned roughly, I think, 60 or 70% of the stock, was worth $22 billion. And he was looking at, being another Bill Gates at that time. They discovered that there was some accounting regularities in their books, and the stock basically crashed overnight. Uh, I think at its height, it cost $351 a share. Before that crash was all through for his company, his shares of stock had gone down to something like 40 cents a share, from $351 to 41 cents a share. 40 cents a share. Now, he was still worth a lot of money after that. I mean, he wasn't a poor man, and his business was actually fundamentally sound. In spite of the accounting error. So he went on, and he persisted. His was a service business, so he performed the services. His business did it fairly well, and he grew it over the years, and he still is in business today. And I haven't checked the stock price uh, of late, but I know that at one time it had recovered to the initial price that it had when it went public, which was $12 a share. So, at $12 a share, he was again a very rich man,
No,
but
it was
not
about
worth.
341.
Right. I mean, he was not worth the $22 billion anymore, and it was really a monumental crash there. And if something happens to if unexpected things happen to the stock market and happen to the profits, okay, of Amazon, but during that time, I think it's perfectly possible for Bezos to suddenly be worth $3 or $4 or $5 billion. I mean, I'm not saying that's not a lot of money.
Well, yeah, well, he wouldn't go hungry. He
Yeah, I mean, he wouldn't go hungry, but he wouldn't be one of the richest men in the world anymore either. So,
Yep,
a lot of it is not really solid.
yeah, I feel like current legislation is built on really protecting that. That's the name of the game. Seems to be from my point of view. Anything can
Okay,
happen.
so if in closing you'd like to give people a donation button, then that would probably be good. Have you got a donation button that's available yet for your
Uh,
campaign?
Not one that's available right now. I will have a crowd pack very soon that will be accessible through the website, rosterforgeorgia.com. Uh, we'll have all the links there live after the primaries. So
Okay.
on May 22nd at 11:59 p.m., the website and everything else goes live.
Okay. Okay. So thanks for coming.
Thank you
I
for having
enjoyed
me.
our conversation, and hopefully sometime we may see you later.
I'd appreciate it. You have a great day.
Okay. Okay, and you too. Have a great night and a great day tomorrow. Okay, so finally, folks, I want to give you the normal commercial messages. Sorry about that. Uh, we have a donation button, okay, at Real Progressives also, at our Patreon account. Okay, so if you go to Patreon, you can find it there. And I have a donation button, okay, at Patreon too. And so I need to mention that as well. So thank you very much for coming. This was my second live stream of the evening, and I know my live streams are hard to sit through sometimes. I hope this particular live stream, okay, was interesting to you. It was a surprise to me. I was intending to interview a congressional candidate, and somehow we got confused on this one until very recently. Brian Rosser was a congressional candidate in the Georgia 14th, and I had no idea that he dropped out of that. So I did my best to, make it an interesting interview. In spite of that, I think he's a good person, who probably is a good person to vote for at the state level. Certainly, he seems to be monumentally better than his opponent. So if you're going to be in the voting booth, okay, and you're voting anyway, he seems like a good one to vote for. He seems to have an open mind, okay, and a willingness to learn. And I did feed him a little bit, okay, of MMT kind of on the side, okay, in my way. So we'll follow him, okay, and see what happens with him. And hopefully sometime in the future, we'll meet him again at the congressional level. And we hope in the meantime he wins at the state level and does a good job there. So thank you again very much for coming. I think it's good night time for everybody. Russell Goldman says it's 12:10 a.m. I made it. Well, thank you for persisting. I know not too many people are night persons like myself. So good night again. I am signing off.